Hello everyone, and you're very welcome to today's CPD Professional Subject Knowledge webinar for the Science T-Level. And the focus of today's webinar will be for the content from section A3 of the Science Specification, relating to the health, safety and environmental regulations in the health and science sector. But first, the plan for today's session is to begin with some quick introductions, a brief overview of the T-Level qualification. Then we're going to look at the content of element A3 and provide some support and guidance for its delivery, some example scenarios, and where content can be linked to element A4 as well. Opportunities to share your ideas and suggestions, and finally to address any questions you may have. But please continue to ask questions throughout this webinar, as we will be addressing them as we go. And this session is also being recorded, and you can access the slides that are being used from the handout section of the GoToWebinar control panel. But first, I would just like to begin with a little poll just to gauge your current confidence with the teaching, the delivery, the content, etc. that is within section A3. So to begin with, this is a 1 if you're not very confident at the moment, and a 10 if you feel extremely confident with the teaching, the delivery, and the content within there. So you should see that little poll on your screen. So if you just put where you think you are at the moment. Okay, about 75% of the votes in, quite low down on the scale so far. I'll just give that another few moments. So we have 33% in the 1 to 2 bracket, 67% in the 3 to 4 bracket, so very much the lower end at the moment. 50-50 split now between 1 to 2 and 3 to 4. Okay, I'll just give that another 10 seconds. Okay, we do have some who are feeling a little bit more confident, 20% in the 7. Some people feeling a little bit more confident, 20% in the 7 to 8 bracket, but most in the 1 to 2 or 3 to 4 range. Okay, I'm just going to close off that poll. Hopefully we can get you feeling a little bit more confident as we move through today's webinar. But first, just a few quick introductions. So my name is David Kiernan, and I work in the provider development team at NCFE. And I support centres with the delivery of our qualifications, the structure, the assessments, and anything related to teaching and learning. My direct email is shown, but if I'm unavailable, then please use our general provider development email address. I'm also joined today by Joe, who will also briefly introduce himself.
Thank you, David. Hello everyone. My name is Joe Neame, and I'm the Science Subject Specialist here at the NCFE, meaning I support with science queries across the business and our various qualifications. But I also spend a lot of time supporting with the delivery of the T-Level in science, the structure, and anything related to teaching and learning. My direct email address is also shown there, and back over to you, David.
Thanks very much, Joe. So, going to begin, as we do have a variation of people here, just with a brief overview of the T-Levels and the assessments therein as well. For more comprehensive information, do please see one of our onboarding webinars. So to begin with, we're going to look at what exactly is a T-Level. So T-Levels, they are level 3 qualifications, a 2-year program that is aimed at 16 to 19-year-olds. And they are equivalent in size, rigor, and depth to 3 A-levels and do attract UCAS points as well. T-Levels are owned by the Institute for Apprenticeships and Technical Education, and the design and content of the T-Levels came from employer panels in the relevant industries. Because of these employer panels, T-Levels offer students a route to paid employment. And UCAS points are also available for the completion of a T-Level, so students can progress on or onto a higher level apprenticeship. Now, the entire design of the T-Levels is to ensure that students have the threshold competency for the relevant occupational role. And that is the most important aspect, ensuring students have that threshold competency. The specification itself can be divided into 2 sections, the core component and the occupational specialism content. So the core content is further divided into 3 sections. Section A, working in the health and science sector. Section B, which is the scientific knowledge, concepts and understanding of biology, chemistry and physics, and the core skills. So the core content and skills form the foundation that the occupational specialism content is built upon. Now, some of this content is also called root content, meaning it's going to be common to the health and the healthcare science T-levels too. The Section A root content are the 4 areas that are shown on the screen currently, and all of B1 is also root content. When it comes to the occupational specialisms, as of September 2021, there are 3 live ones. Now, the content, knowledge, and skills will differ from one occupational specialism to another. Again, because it's all about students having that threshold competency for that job role. There is one other part of the technical qualification that I want to highlight, which is the general competency framework. This lists the English, maths, and digital skills competencies that students will also be taught. The focus here is for students to have that threshold competency, and this list of English, maths, and digital competencies are embedded within the specification. But it would be useful to develop these further with your students if possible. The T-level assessments can be broken down into the core assessments and the occupational specialism assessments. So for the core assessments, they consist of 2 written exam papers covering core content in Section A and Section B, and an externally set skills assessment called an employer set project, so called as the task had input from employers to make them as realistic as possible. The occupational specialism is assessed in Year 2 with externally set synoptic assignments, which are also designed to be as occupationally realistic as possible. Well, I'm now going to hand over to Joe, our subject specialist, who will go through the A3 content.
Thanks, David, and hello again, everyone. So, as David's previously mentioned, we're going to be looking at A3 health, safety and environmental regulations within the health and science sector. Specifically, we're going to be looking at the content, the depth of content, some delivery ideas, and answering any questions that you may have. Now, throughout the session, there will be a Padlet open for you to refer to the specification points that we will be covering. This will allow you to add any comments or ideas that you may have with the initial planning and the delivery of the A3 content. It can also be updated with any ideas that might pop up throughout the session to ensure we are sharing good practice amongst ourselves. There's also a section for any general concerns that will help us with the future support and planning of these knowledge webinars. And please be aware that that is just for general concerns around any other specification sections that you may have and want covered in the future. Any questions that you have specific to this webinar and its content, please make sure you pop into the question box. And the link for the Padlet will be going into the chat box now. And I'll just give us a couple of seconds just to make sure we can access that. Okay, so if there's any problems with that, please do pop into the chat saying that there's an issue. So we decided to cover A3 within this session as it's one that stood out to be potentially difficult to deliver in terms of the content and specifically the depth in which it needs to be delivered. And it's good to see that backed up within the poll at the start there. Straight away on the screen, you can see A3.1, which contains 12 pieces of legislation and regulation within the health and science sectors. Now, this would take students a large amount of time if they try to understand and recall these pieces of legislation and regulation in a lot of detail. However, this is not required by the specification. In terms of interpreting the specification, the point in bold is the overarching learning point that the students must understand, and then any subsequent bullet points or sub-bullet points provide the depth that the students need to know. So if we take the Health and Safety at Work Act 1974 as an example, students simply need to know that its purpose is defining the employer's responsibilities to protect the health, safety and welfare at work of employees and members of the public, and defines employees' duties to protect themselves and others. They don't need to know the entire white paper, which I'll come on and talk about more when we look at sourcing information about these pieces of regulation and legislation. An example of where you will need to go into more detail is when cost regulations are covered once again within A4. However, I'll be going through this example later on in the session, specifically about how to link the two topics together and get students to apply their understanding. The only other example of this cross-link between A3 and A4 is the Environmental Protection Act 1990. So here again, we can see the other 6 pieces of legislation and regulations that students need to be aware of. And just to reinforce the point, it is just the purpose of these pieces of regulation and legislation that students need to be aware of. So as another example, if we looked at the hazardous waste regulations of 2005, its purpose is to control the storage, transport and disposal of hazardous waste to ensure it's appropriately managed and any risks are minimised. I won't read through them all individually, as you can find them on the specification. And more importantly, I want to go through some examples of how this could actually be delivered to students, as well as some application examples. In terms of delivery then, if we look at the activities present on the scheme of work, you can see here that it suggests a group activity where students are to be given a task sheet with the following legislations and regulations on, and space underneath for each of the students to make notes on the purpose of it. It then goes on to suggest a class discussion where students suggest and share their ideas, which then leads on to a challenge activity where students could be given an example of where this legislation could be used within the health and science sector. Now, this challenge activity is very important as it offers students a chance to apply what they've learned in line with that AO2 skill within our specification and our assessments. So AO2, or Assessment Objective 2, requiring students to apply knowledge and understanding of context, concepts, theories, and principles in science to different situations and context. Now, this skill accounts for 40% of marks within the core assessments. So therefore, it's important to make sure students have the ability to take that information and apply it to a scenario, which I'll talk more about in a short while. So just to expand the information given on the previous slide out into a bit more of a plan, I've bullet pointed here a step-by-step as to how to go about the potential delivery of A3.1 content. So it would start with students researching the regulations and legislations from the specification, and you could potentially provide some links to help them source that relevant information. Then, using their own research, they then create a summary of each, and once they have those summaries, they can then have a class discussion to share their ideas and collectively come up with succinct summaries of each piece of regulation and legislation. Now, this is important to help students embed the knowledge through articulating what they've learned. After this, present students with a scenario where they have to apply a relevant piece of legislation covered. Again, this application will be important to secure their understanding of those pieces of regulation and legislation. So, using this model as an example, the one that you've provided to them, the challenge could then be that students come up with their own application examples of regulations and then test each other. So getting the students to create, as we know, is invaluable for learning. As we know, when students just have to write a summary, they may not be engaged and therefore not retain that information for long periods of time. Whereas when we get them to apply and create something with that information, they are much more likely to retain that learning. Finally, students could self-assess those summaries they've produced against the purpose stated within the specification to see if they've understood. And before we move on, I'm just going to ask David to come in just to check if there's any questions that need answering within the chat.
No new questions have come in at the moment, and it's a good point to just reinforce. If you do have any questions at any point, please do type them into that question box.
Brilliant, thank you, David. So in order to provide further support, I did some research into each piece of legislation to find some useful links that could be given to students to help within their research. Now, for the first link, the gov.uk legislation website appeared first when searching for the Health and Safety Act. However, this website has the full legislation on, and therefore it is not very user or in fact student friendly. So for most cases, I've actually provided a link to the Health and Safety Executive website, or HSE, as it provides much clearer and much more user-friendly summaries. For some pieces of regulation and legislation, I couldn't find a HSE relevant link, and so you'll see that there have been some others provided that were from varying sources. In fact, all the regulations and legislations on this page can be found at HSE, except the Environmental Protection Act, which was more difficult to source, but using the link, it will take you to an insurance summary that actually gives a nice overview of the Environmental Protection Act. Again, you don't have to provide these links, nor do you have to provide them at all. But if you give students that bit of direction they need with their research to come up with their own summaries of each piece of regulation and legislation, it may just give them that bit of direction they need to come up with that succinct summary. And then you can get, if you wanted to, you could source a couple of these links and then get students to source the rest of them. Again, these are just delivery ideas. So here I've provided links to the other 6 pieces of regulation and legislation. There are a few more examples here of where I've had to provide links from other sources rather than just the HSE website. So examples of this would be the specialist waste regulations from Lewisham Council, a waste care website for the hazardous waste regulations, and even the London Fire Brigade for the regulator reform. All other regulations and legislations can be found on the HSE. Again, these links are just examples. Students may be able to research further and find others that give them more information or better clarity in terms of a summary. Also, please remember that these links are available on the slides that's available in the handout section in the chat there. So along with any other information being covered. Also, it's worth to note, as David mentioned earlier, the general digital competencies and the other general competencies. Encouraging students to do their own research here helps them to meet some of those general digital competencies, including GDC1, using digital technology and media effectively, as well as GDC5, being safe and responsible online. And here we can see an example of a potential worksheet layout linking back to the scheme of work activity that could be used during the session. This is just an example, and obviously you may want to adapt it or differentiate it for your own students. Again, you may want to include some of those links as a bit of direction. But we're now going to look at in more detail in terms of potential scenarios on the following slide, and remembering that you may wish to model a scenario first and then get students to create their own as a challenge. So here we have an example scenario provided, which is a lab technician slips and falls and fractures their radius. What relevant regulations and legislations should be applied here? And in order just to break up the session slightly, I'm going to ask you to follow the link in the chat to a poll where you can access your current understanding of the regulations. Just quite simply, just tick in the regulations and legislations you think apply to this situation. And I'm just going to give us a couple of minutes, one just to access the link and to answer the question. We'll also look to see if there's any more questions that need answering.
Yeah, we've just had one question in, Joe, just as they're coming in. Melanie asking if there's a scheme of work. So Melanie, there is actually a scheme of work on the on the QualHub page. So we do have free schemes of work that's available to download with suggested activities on them. So by all means, you should have a portal login to be able to download the teaching and learning material that we have on there. But all the schemes of work are free, and there are suggested activities on there too.
Thanks, David. I'll just give us 30 more seconds just for people to access the Slido and answer and just tick the regulations you think apply here. Okay, so quite an even split amongst those. Just scroll up and see the other options. Yeah, perfect. So split amongst some of the other ones, but the correct answers were, move on to the next slide. So the Health and Safety at Work Act 1974, Management of Health and Safety at Work Regulations 1999, and Reporting of Injuries, Diseases and Dangerous Occurrence Regulations 2013. Now, obviously, that's just a very quick formative assessment. You could then get students to justify their selection using their own summaries. This justification will then help with that retention of the regulations. So again, just quite simply as an example, RIDA would be applicable here, as the employer would need to report a serious workplace accident. Just quite simply, students would be linking the purpose and summary that they have come up with to the RIDA legislation. So also just as another little break just before we move on, we're now going to review the Padlet and share some good practice around A3.1. So you may have some other links available, or you may have just come up with some other ideas around the delivery of the regulations and legislation. So if you have any good sources of information or any good ideas, please feel free to share these also. I'll give us a few minutes. Again, don't worry if you don't have any. Will just give us a few minutes just to share any good ideas that have come up. So I can see people typing in terms of the core B content query there that's come up about the detail, how much detail and depth to go into. Absolutely, we'll look for future support.
And just to add to that, there has actually been a few webinars already regarding the physics content, and there's going to be one on the biology content next week, actually, starting with cells, and also on chemistry as well later on in October. So do have a look for them as well. It's part of a little collaboration we're doing with STEM Learning. So we're doing some free webinars there, and they will be having some follow-up sessions as well, breaking it down even further. So there is some specific to the B content as well.
They're starting to get more ideas in now. So using CLEAP's safety data sheets for practicals. Students have a map of the college to find posters, maps of safety equipment, fire doors, to work in groups to locate them all. I like that idea, getting them to move about a bit. Run a risk assessment for a practical. We'll actually talk about that a bit more later on in the session. And then using SCORM packages from the Blended Learning Consortium through the VLE Moodle.
And just that general knowledge question has come in, how can I find the details on these webinars? So they are on the provider support page. So on the provider support page for TLevels, there's links to the key date schedule, links to our webinars, links to all those sort of useful documents, parent engagement stuff. So the provider support page.
Brilliant. Just to summarize those ideas that have come through them. So using the SCORM packages from the Blended Learning Consortium through the VLE model, running a risk assessment for a practical, which again, brilliant, I will be coming back round to that idea a bit later on. Students have a map of the college to find posters, maps, safety equipment, fire doors, etc. to work in groups and locate them all. Using the lab technician to set up an accident, which can then be safely approached and monitored. Ask for technicians to share and explain safe practices for cleaning up breakages. And then use of CLEAP's safety data sheets for practicals. Brilliant. What's been brilliant about all of those ideas as well is it's those real life applications, especially getting the technicians to come in and help, which is what, you know, a big part of the A content is obviously having that real life application. And then just one more there, share accidents that have been reported in the press. So as I previously mentioned, there is a link within A3 to A4. Now this is important as one, it helps reduce planning time when content is linked together. Two, it contextualizes the student's learning. And finally, it creates an opportunity for spaced repetition so that when students reach A4, they can then go back and recall some of that learning from A3. Now you find this a lot through the specification, and we will be covering another example of cross-linking a bit later on, where you can embed certain content from A3 throughout the specification. So on this slide is all the relevant information for the application of COSH legislation, which is found within A4. As well as providing a link between these two topics, it also presents perhaps a welcome opportunity and a welcome break for students from purely focusing on legislation and regulation. Now, in terms of delivery, this could be done as part of the same session by highlighting to students that as they get to the COSH regulation, they need to go into further detail to cover the definition of a biohazard, the hazard groups, and then the potential implications of not following COSH regulations. So once the students then understand those key definitions along with the hazard groups, you can then provide them with an example scenario as presented on this slide. So a food science technician is working with a strain of Salmonella. The strain has been identified as a category 3 biohazard. Explain why this bacterium is classed as a biohazard and the implications of the strain being category 3. Suggest what risks this strain poses to the employees if the COSH regulations are not met. Now, this is a useful scenario because it assesses students' recall of the key terminology as well as the category system. It then also gets the students to apply that definition of a category 3 biohazard. Please note the command words also being used here. So explain is being used in order to assess their understanding of the key terms, and then suggest being that command word that's getting them to apply their knowledge. Now, I know there will be questions around where this has come from, or where this question has come from as people are trying to search for more assessment materials. This was just put together by myself using the specification, using the specimen papers to help with the language of the question, and then I formed this scenario using that information. So here we can see the answer. So applying those definitions from the specification and the information they will have researched. So this bacterium is a biohazard as it is a microorganism that causes infection, in brackets pathogen. Being in category 3 means that this Salmonella strain can cause human disease and pose a serious risk to employees and the wider population. However, there should be an effective treatment available. If COSH regulations are not met, this poses a serious risk, a risk to employees and wider population's health. However, this should be a short-term risk. As previously mentioned, there will be an effective treatment. Now, depending on their prior understanding, students may know the term pathogen. However, if you've not come round to teaching B2 yet, they may not be aware of this term, and that's absolutely fine if pathogen is therefore not included in their answer. And this would not be an issue at this stage, but it would be good practice to perhaps introduce them to the term here, again helping with that spaced repetition of knowledge. Also, based on prior understanding, students may also be able to suggest that treatment would in fact be antibiotics, as Salmonella itself is a bacterium. Use of antibiotics actually isn't within B1 or B2, but if you do have some food science students within the class, so students who are pursuing the food science occupational specialism, antibiotics does appear there, and so it may be good again with that spaced repetition to cover it here. Before we move on, I'll just ask David again just to check if there's any questions that need answering at this stage.
Not at the minute, Joe. No new questions have come in.
Perfect, brilliant. Thank you, David. Again, if you do have any questions, feel free to just pop them into the chat as they appear. So going back to A3 then. So A3.2 looks at how to assess and minimize potential hazards and risks, including specific levels of risk by using the Health and Safety Executive's 5 steps to risk assessment. Now, just to make sure we keep to the hour even for the rest of the A3 content, I've included where to source more information and then also how I would go about the delivery of the content. So within A3.2, it presents us with the 5 steps to risk assessment. Based on the steps being sub-bullet points, again, this shows us the depth that the students need to be able to recall and apply these steps. Like with the regulations and legislations, a link has been provided for more information, and this can also be taught through research and scenario-based learning. However, and this also appeared on the Padlet as well, you could in fact embed this across the course, as every time a student is about to undertake a practical, you could get them to do the 5 steps to risk assessment, helping them to recall that knowledge all the way throughout the content. For the first couple of practicals, for example, students could undertake, or you could undertake a model of these 5 steps with them, walk them through the 5 steps, after which students then complete them in groups for the next couple of practicals, and then after that, they could complete it independently until it becomes that second nature. So moving on to A3.3 then, is about how health and safety at work is promoted. Now there's various bullet points here containing guidance and different strategies around how to promote health and safety in various contexts. And again, a link is provided to the HSE website with more information about health and safety at work being promoted. It's very much from a manager's point of view, that information, but it still will be useful for students to gain some ideas on how the health and safety is actually promoted within the workplace. An example of a delivery idea is that students could in fact come up with their own promotion campaign for the health and safety regulation within a setting of their interest. So for example, a metrology lab. If this was done on a computer, then it would actually help students again to achieve some general digital competencies, so GDC 1, 2, and 3. Again, GDC 1 being using digital technology and media effectively, GDC 2 being able to design, create, and edit documents and digital media, and GDC 3, communication and collaborating. If this was then presented as a poster, this would also be good practice for task 4 within the employer set project. So as they would have to produce a presentation and time permitting, potentially do the presentation as well. This would cover a lot of the core skills assessed within the ESP. So if students did research into the promotion of health and safety, which they would need to, that would cover core skill 2 of researching. By making the poster, that would cover core skill 4 for creativity and innovation. Core skill 6 would be embedded for communication by doing and presenting their presentation or their poster. And then finally, if students then evaluated their presentation, that could hit core skill 7 of reflective evaluation. This is just an example of how core skills for the ESP can also be embedded within content. So A3.4 summarizes the learning of the topic quite nicely so far. You may find actually though that through various applied scenarios that you and the students have come up with, that they may have already achieved this specification point. So through the scenarios that they have created, they may have actually already hit this specification point. But just to double check that each of the learning points has been hit, you may want to come up with some specific scenarios, maybe around the spillage of hazardous materials, just to ensure that this specification point is in fact met. So, for example, you could cover the spillage of a concentrated bacterial suspension, which would be linked to securing the area and ensuring it is cleaned up in line with hazardous waste regulations. You could again link it to prior learning. So for example, a colleague is working with a category 3 biohazard and they are not following COSH regulation, nor are they following PPE regulations 1992, suggest the most appropriate course of action. Again, just a scenario, just to get them to 1, to apply this learning, and 2, to link it back to prior learning. And in this situation, students should be able to reference that quite simply using the specification point on the screen is that they would escalate it as appropriate either to a lab manager or the designated health and safety lead. But again, getting them to apply and build on that knowledge that the students will have already covered. They will have to talk about category 3 being causing human disease and maybe a serious hazard to employees and spread to the wider population. And again, linking it back to those hazard categories that we discussed earlier. They can also go on to say that even though there is usually an effective vaccine or other treatments available, the colleague should be wearing the appropriate PPE to prevent causing serious harm to other employees and the wider population, and make sure that they are working in line with the PPE regulations. So again, that was a whistle-stop tour of A3.2 to A3.4. That may have hopefully given you a chance to come up with potentially some more ideas. So we're just going to give you 5 minutes to again show and review the Padlet, and then we're going to discuss any points raised on there. And already I can see more points being raised already. In terms of will NCFE be releasing any more exam questions? No, the only questions available will be the ones within the specimen papers. But what is quite useful is obviously, as David mentioned previously, there is that root content and much shared amongst science, healthcare science and health. So what you can do is go onto the health page on QualHub, find the paper for the B paper for health and anything covered within the section, the first section relating to B1 content. You can use those questions as extras.
Absolutely, and as A3 is actually part of that root content as well, the health paper A will also have stuff related to A3, and so will healthcare science related to A3, as will the teaching resources. In our teaching resources, we do have the essentials pack, which are free resources, and there's also the additional paid for resources on a yearly license. Inside there, there's other activity sheets, home study sheets, etc., which will have other questions and case studies and stuff like that that you can use with your students too.
So some more ideas come through. So students research different biohazard lab grading and what PPE restrictions labs are required. Yeah, absolutely. Again, just a couple more minutes in case you want to add any more ideas to the Padlet. Feel free to add any more general concerns or any other, take this opportunity to add any specification sections that you'd like to see within a webinar in the future.
Just in terms of where to find the webinar details, we can probably show you some of that at the end of this webinar as well, actually.
Okay, so just to summarize some of the ideas that have come through. So again, just to go back to that question, so will NCFE be releasing any more exam questions? So the only exam questions that will be available are those found within the specimen papers. But as we said before, okay, obviously the root A content as well as the B1 content is the same across the healthcare science and science TLevel. The A content being the content that David mentioned at the start. So you can go find the QualHub pages for health, healthcare science and science, and then use each exam papers to find those relevant questions to help build up a bit more of a bank of resources in terms of those questions. So some of the other ideas we've got is students research different biohazard lab grading and what PPE restrictions and lab spec are required. Some health and safety, share their job roles within college. Again, brilliant, getting that real life application to the students. The role of fire wardens and tally boards. And then again, in that final column, another new idea, again, getting that health and safety team in college to present what their role is, giving them that real life application. So I'm going to hand back over to David, who's going to take you through the poll now at the end of the session.
Thanks very much for that, Joe. So gone through section A3, and I was just wanted to get another gauge how you're feeling after going through this, given some ideas for delivery and so on. Just in terms of your confidence now, again, 1 being little to no confidence, 10 being very confident. Oh, we got quite a few votes already in. Excellent. So we have 67% right now in the 5 to 6 bracket. Well, just changed 40%, 5 to 6, 60% and 7 to 8. That's good. Again, if there's any questions, anything you still want to ask, do pop them into the chat box. nearly done with both. 86% of the votes are in right now. And we have 33% in the 5 to 6 and 67% in 7 to 8. So everyone is 5 or above currently, which is good. Much improvement from the 1 to 2 and 3 to 4 that most people are in. Good. Remember, do put any questions that you have into the question box. Just going to close off that poll. And what we're going to do is we will remain on here for the remaining few minutes of this webinar, and I will address some of the things that have come through, like where to find webinars and so on. However, if you don't have any questions and you know, do by all means feel free to leave at this point. If you would like to stay, do pop any questions in, please do as well. If you are leaving now though, I would appreciate if you'd complete the short evaluation that will pop up. Your feedback is vital to us. And if you are leaving now, very much thank you to Joe, and from everyone here at NCFE, we would like to wish you a very safe and successful year. So one question here, if the recording will be sent, absolutely, the recording will be sent. So what I'm going to do is just in terms of where to find some of the webinars and so on that was being asked about. So what you can hopefully see on the screen right now, in terms of those webinars, we do have this TLevel provider support page. So if you're a approved center, you'll already have met with your account exec. You all have a dedicated account exec when you're approved who help you with the day-to-day running of TLevels and so on. It's either Danielle Johnson, Bradley Pierce, or Emma King, and they will have provided you a link undoubtedly to this page as well. So our different bulletins that are sent out, our emails, parent and learner engagement, but in terms of webinars, where it was just mentioned, we do have our support webinars here. So when you go onto this page, for those delivering in 2021, so this was for those who began last year with the education and childcare, we can see the webinar series and registration links on here. So if we're just interested, which I'm just going to look at the health and science route right now, our CPD webinar, so online CPD and training, which is what we have today. Our green here at the end for our health and science delivery staff. Our webinars are actually, and you can access recordings of any of these as well just by clicking on the link, such as this science prep to teach one that already has occurred, the maths competencies, physics core and further science concepts, the one that we've had today, our professional knowledge webinar just done by Joe. There's going to be one for health as well on Thursday, and one for science and so on. So at any point you just click here to be able to register onto those. And in terms of the resources elements that were being mentioned, so on the science Qual Hub page, just when the schemes of work were asked about earlier, in the teaching materials section, what we do have is core schemes of work. So this is for all the A elements, for the B1 and so on, where these are available to download for free. Use them as you wish, edit them, change them around to suit the needs of your center. Every center is going to be different, but hopefully they provide you with a good starting point, different activities and so on, as well as that different teaching resources as well, including an e-learning presentation resource, activity sheets, interactive PDFs and so on. Now, while there isn't an element for A3 on here, there is actually on the health TLevel page. So if you did go onto the health TLevel page, so this is where I mentioned about some of that root content earlier, there is some examples on here for A3. So health, safety, and environmental regulations. So you could use those resources. And as well, as I mentioned earlier, some of these, there is going to be also additional resources covering all the content available on a yearly license to access. But for now, it's very useful to have a look at the free resources. And in terms of science as well, you might find some other information on the STEM learning website, so stem.org.uk/TLevel resources. They have actually pulled resources together for Section A, Section B, and the general maths competencies as well. So in terms of Section A that we're just doing, health, safety, and environmental information on there too. So just having a look to see if there's another question. Someone put in the question box, they've added another question to the Padlet. B1 health and science are the same in relation to spec, but I was wondering if both groups would need the same level of depth as lab science students are finding the content. B1 is the same needed for all of B1, but if you do have lab science students, they are obviously coming in more geared towards doing a science level 3 qualification. Health students wouldn't be as much, so maybe they might struggle a little bit more. Maybe they've got more of a health mind on them, thinking about nursing or the mental health care team or midwifery or whichever occupational specialism they may be going for. But it is the same level of depth for B1. What you'll find is B2 does go into more depth just in terms of that content. For example, if we were looking at, there's a section in B1 to do with rates of reaction, to use as an example. And in B1, it is very simple, just about how temperature affects rates of reaction, and that's common to health and to science. Then in B2, on science, there's further information about rates of reaction, talking about kinetic changes and so on. That's not present on health because any health students wouldn't need that extra depth to do with rates of reaction. But everything in B1 is root content and to be delivered to the same depth. But then you will find extra information that's separate in the B2s for the specific pathway, and likewise for the occupational specialism too. So I hope that's helped with that question. Oh, you're very welcome. Thanks for this today. It's been very helpful. You're very welcome. And thank you very much as well to Joe for putting all these slides together and coming up with these examples. Thank you very much, Joe. If there's no further questions, as I mentioned, do feel free to leave, but would really appreciate if you'd complete the little evaluation that will pop up at the end. As I mentioned, your feedback really important to us. And again, if I don't have quite a few people leave this session, as I mentioned earlier, useful. Here's wishing everyone a very safe and successful year.